Tumblr might not be considered a social media OG in the same way MySpace, Facebook, or Twitter would be. But if you were a teenager or young adult in the 2010s, Tumblr was definitely a part of your digital life, and it absolutely influenced the way an entire generation experienced and engaged with pop culture, explored their interests, and even themselves. Tumblr existed in two contrasting spaces at the same time. It had its niche audiences who were part of their own respective subcultures, but it was also popular enough to be frequented by and a source of inspiration for the likes of Kylie Jenner, Bella Hadid, Ariana Grande, etc. It also helped boost the early careers of artists that would eventually become some of the biggest names we know in music today. And although it's still an active platform with a very engaged user base, it's faded from the center of social media to a memory of the 2010s cultural zeitgeist. So all things considered, in this video, we're gonna do a deep dive into the life of Tumblr, including its founding, its massive cultural impact, and why it didn't sustain itself in ways we would have expected long term. Tumblr was founded by a prodigy, okay? David Karp founded it in 2007 when he was just 21 years old. He was raised in the Upper East Side of Manhattan and went to the Bronx High School of Science, which is one of the most prestigious public high schools in the United States, with a pretty stacked list of prolific alumni that includes Neil deGrasse Tyson and New York City Mayor Zohran Mamdani. In fact, it's such a prolific school that it's produced the most Nobel Prize laureates of any high school in the US. However, right after his freshman year, David dropped out and chose to be homeschooled. And he made this decision so that he could work on the projects that he believes would help him get into colleges like MIT. But as his endeavors began to unfold and lead him down other paths, he ended up not returning to high school or even getting his diploma. The reason why he ended up going down this very untraditional path was because while he was being homeschooled, he started taking Japanese classes and getting tutored at the Japan Society, which is a nonprofit organization aimed at facilitating a connection between Japanese culture, business, and society with audiences in New York. While taking his Japanese classes, David was also working with a math tutor, and they ended up collaborating on software for winning at blackjack and poker. And by the time he turned 17, he started working for Urban Baby, which was an online parenting forum focused on discussions around urban motherhood. And David wasn't brought on to the Urban Baby team as your regular entry-level employee. He was brought on as the head of product. And this was because he actually completed tech work that the Urban Baby team thought would take him a couple of days to do in 4 hours. Okay, so not only was he a prodigy, he was a speedy one. As David continued to develop his career and be an active internet user, he was inspired by Tumblr, which were microblogs or shorter versions of blogs that emerged in the mid-2000s and consisted of short form and mixed media posts as opposed to long form ones. So things like quotes, images, short text blocks, etc. Sounds familiar. Some examples of these Tumblr logs were Koteki by Jason Koteki, I'm sorry if I'm not pronouncing that correctly, which is still active today, and as you can see, delivers its curated content in short blurbs, and Projectionist by Justin Hall. There were probably some more, and I did try to do a deep scour of the internet for others, but this was all I could find, and at this point of the internet timeline, I was still playing Dress Up on Stardoll and Sandwich Stacker on Disney, so I can't draw any from my personal memory. That said, if this was in your time and there are any that you remember that I'm not mentioning, leave them down below. So yeah, in general, this era was peak blog culture. There were gossip blogs like Perez Hilton, Delisted, TMZ actually started as a blog. There were lifestyle blogs, and with that came blog hosting platforms like LiveJournal and WordPress and all the others. Yet despite the presence of all of these blogs and blog hosting platforms, David felt like the blogging ecosystem had reached a point where it became so popular and established that it was essentially formalized. And so he wanted to create something that merged the essence of blogs with his appreciation for Tumblr logs, but was meant for casual posting,
since no one else was filling that gap.
There was sort of WordPress, I guess Twitter had just
Yeah,
begun.
the blogosphere was really pretty mature. It had matured, though, to a place that was really designed for editorial publishing. So kind of everything after movable type had a title, several paragraphs of text, a footer, a permalink page with comments. All blogs really took the same form, which is great for that type of publishing. But something that I really wanted out of my website, out of my blog, was something much more free-form, something much less verbose, where I could share the things that I was like working on, the things that I was just kind of coming across on the web, be it like a funny YouTube video or a photo of something I just took.
Yeah.
And the tools at the time really weren't built for that.
Shortly after David identified this gap in the blogging market, he joined forces with Marco Arment, who was a lead developer and chief technology officer of Tumblr. It didn't take long for David to get proof of concept. When Tumblr was in its user testing phase, blog readers were really excited about the platform because it provided them with tools to create blogs of their own.
So we first released it to this community of again, avant-garde bloggers. A lot of them were in the Ruby on Rails community, these people that were hacking together tools to do that sort of stuff. We showed it to them and said, hey, listen, look, we're building this stuff inspired by all of these neat new blogs you're creating. What do you think? And the bloggers thought it was awesome. And their readers, who maybe didn't have the chops to hack the stuff together themselves, were thrilled because now they could take a stab at it themselves.
Essentially, David's goal was to create something that had all of the blogging and tumble logging content mediums available to users without editorial expectations. In an interview with The Guardian, he said, "The only real tools for expression these days are YouTube, which turns my stomach. They take your creative works, your film that you poured hours and hours of energy into, and they put ads on top of it. They make it as gross an experience to watch your film as possible. I'm sure it will contribute to Google's bottom line. I'm not sure it will inspire any creators." And this specific vision of merging casual posting and limitless creative expression is exactly what made Tumblr so commercially different and culturally significant. And within 2 weeks of its launch in February of 2007, Tumblr gained 75,000 users. After just 2.5 years in operation, Tumblr's user base grew exponentially, with 225 million monthly impressions, 50 million monthly visitors. At this time, social media platforms weren't calculating monthly active users yet, and over 500,000 posts being generated per day. And once 2010 came around, that performance was completely blown out of the water, with Tumblr being one of the top 50 sites in terms of traffic in the US, generating 4.5 million posts a day and 300 million page views a month. And that growth was actually larger than the entire network was the year prior. Then, just 4 years later in 2014, which was one of, if not the peak year of Tumblr, which we're gonna get to in a second, Tumblr had an audience of 420 million, on top of the fact that it was a king in the cultural zeitgeist. But before we get into Tumblr's outsized generational influence, I wanna go over the mechanics of the platform that helped make it so impactful in the first place. First of all, Tumblr lowered participation barriers. Users didn't have to know how to code a blog. They didn't have to buy a fancy camera to take photos and videos. They didn't have to know how to use sophisticated editing software, because you could just curate your blog by meticulously selecting what content you'd reblog from other people. Now, of course, people did take creation into their own hands, like hanging out and taking pictures with your friends for Tumblr was an event back in those days. But whether you added content to the platform or just engaged with what was already on it, all that really mattered on Tumblr was having taste and maintaining a blog that someone could land on, check out, and be like, yeah, I'm gonna follow that one. It was also a place where a lot of users separated themselves from their real world identity, which is unlike today's social media use, because most people use social media as a billboard for their lives. A lot of people, not all, but a lot, weren't using Tumblr with their real names. You couldn't also see people's followers count. And so because of that, many users were either anonymously or pseudonymously online, which adds to the importance of having taste and needing to have taste, because a lot of people weren't being followed because they were already popular or socially validated and you could see how many people were following them. They were being followed because people genuinely connected with the world that they were curating through their blog. Like, honestly, if you were a heavy Tumblr user in the 2010 to 2015 era, I think it'd be fair to say that that absolutely counts as some type of experience in creative direction, because people were very committed to curating and maintaining themed blogs with engaged communities around them, and extremely engaged ones at that. And through this highly engaging curation first experience users had with the platform, they were essentially building their own digital universe that felt extremely personal and intimate, which is also why Tumblr had this kind of alternative feel to it. Every blog was curated through the people you followed, the music you discovered, the aesthetics you gravitated to, and the communities you engaged with. Logging onto Tumblr felt like stepping into a portal that took you to your very own deeply personal corner of the internet. And this is especially true when you think about the fact that all of this existed without the interference of a recommendation algorithm, since it didn't even exist yet. So unlike modern social media platforms that are constantly pushing content towards users through recommendations, Tumblr feeds were intentionally built over time and by the users themselves. Okay, so now that we've gone over Tumblr's rise and differentiation, let's get into its impact, specifically how Tumblr operated as an early taste-making machine, how it closed the difference between an aesthetic and an identity, how it helped make progressive conversations socially visible online, and how it transformed fandom culture into some of today's internet communication behaviors. Tumblr had a very specific relationship with underground culture that no platform before or since has been able to replicate. It embraced the alternative because there was a wide appreciation for discovering, engaging with, and curating your blog around alternative interests as they showed up across music, fashion, decor, and other aesthetic-focused aspects of life. And while this was never said explicitly, a huge part of the culture of Tumblr was discovering things before they hit the mainstream. It was kind of like participating in an underground cultural nest where people were constantly discovering and circulating things before they fully entered the mainstream field of view. Like with music, Tumblr users were actively building and participating in aesthetic worlds that corresponded with it, whether it was sad boy / anime rap with artists like Lil Ugly Mane, Young Lean, and Rob Banks, or the indie rock era of Two Door Cinema Club, Vampire Weekend, and the Arctic Monkeys, or the soft grunge aesthetics associated with artists like Grimes, which, say whatever you want about her now, but Visions was and still is a masterpiece. Crystal Castles, the XX, Sky Ferreira, etc. And all these scenes became foundational in shaping the visual identities of people's blogs, as well as signaling to others that they had shared interests. Tumblr also functioned as a taste-making machine for artists with a career trajectory that hadn't crossed into the mainstream yet. Before they became the modern legends that they are now, artists like Lana Del Rey, which we'll get more into later, Tyler the Creator and the Odd Future Collective that included Frank Ocean, A$AP Rocky, specifically with his debut mixtape, and The Weeknd's House of Balloons had Tumblr in a chokehold. And they all had massive momentum on the platform as well. It might be hard to grasp that now because these artists have been a part of larger mainstream culture for a while, but once upon a time, they were very niche internet native artists who weren't yet fully palatable to wider audiences, especially Tyler the Creator, but people on Tumblr gravitated towards them because they reflected this appreciation for the alternative that defined the platform. And of course, out of a genuine appreciation for their art as well. What made all of this feel even more meaningful was that these self-discoveries happens pretty organically. If you've watched any of my other analysis videos on social media, then you know I always connect everything back to the recommendation algorithm or lack of. And that still stands here because, again, all of this was happening in a pre-recommendation algorithm social media landscape. So people weren't being aggressively fed content by a platform that was trying to maximize their engagement. Tumblr users discovered artists, aesthetics, and other niche interests through the people they followed, the communities they participated in, and the people whose taste that they trusted because they had chosen to follow them. And as I mentioned, when I listed fashion, decor, and other aesthetic focused aspects of life, this tastemaking extended across multiple domains. Tumblr heavily embraced brands like American Apparel, which was mainstream enough to be recognizable, but still carried a very particular association with like artsy, alternative, and taste-driven internet culture. I actually worked at an American Apparel in Manhattan during that era while being an avid Tumblr user, so I have an acute understanding of this. Tumblr also embraced soft grunge aesthetics where Doc Martens, creepers, pastel hair, flannels, and more were part of this like uniform. And then you had the vintage aesthetic with film photography, the suitcases, the old books, and anything with a floral pattern. Honestly, looking back now, a lot of these things obviously aren't even niche anymore, but I think it's a testament to how Tumblr and its tastemakers definitely helped push them into the mainstream. One thing Tumblr did that feels especially important in retrospect, because so many people jump from look to look nowadays, especially because of TikTok, is that it blurred the lines between appreciating something for its aesthetic value and identifying with it. I feel like it's actually the natural progression of having a consistent relationship with a platform that is obviously very focused on curation while being young, finding yourself and making sense of the world around you. Like if you're in a place in life where you're experiencing things with a fresh pair of eyes and without the wisdom that comes with being over 26 and having already gone through some shit, and you're regularly engaging with an environment that kind of serves as an outlet to inhabit your emotions in a tasteful way, over time, the distance between the aesthetics of what you're experiencing and your actual identity could start bleeding into the way you understand yourself. In fact, psychological research does show that repeatedly engaging with aesthetics that resonate with someone on an emotional level can shape your self-concept. It can also shape emotional processing and identity performance. And so because of this, Tumblr users, myself included, started to curate themselves in the same fashion they were curating their blogs. And it influenced the way people dressed, the way people decorated their rooms, and even the way people photograph themselves. Like I mentioned earlier, this is where hanging out with your friends and taking pictures for Tumblr became an entire production process that entailed choosing a specific outfit, finding or even creating the right setting, taking the photos, editing them, and then carefully curating how they'd exist on your blog. So at a certain point, how you curated yourself in real life ultimately became an extension of how you curated your Tumblr. Also, Tumblr operated and still operates very differently from other social media platforms because while yes, people were taking pictures for it in the same way, they would take pictures for Instagram, Tumblr's sole focus for people wasn't just to outwardly broadcast themselves. It was also focused on building an immersive, emotional, and aesthetic universe around them using all of the Tumblr content mediums. It wasn't enough to just post yourself. Your blog had to be just as interesting as the photos you were taking. And because some people were on there either anonymously or pseudonymously, many of them also felt comfortable either expressing or engaging with expressions of the parts of themselves they were hiding in real life. Like, Tumblr was absolutely, and still is absolutely, an emotional outlet space where people can openly discuss deeply personal struggles. But since so much of this emotion was also filtered and processed through the aesthetics on there,
A lot of those struggles were romanticized because they were paired with art, photography, music, and just content that perpetually framed their struggles through an artistic lens. And it made suffering appear as aesthetically compelling as it was a signal to have to address something deeper. This is where Lana Del Rey comes back into this conversation because her entire essence, her music, her visual identity, etc., became one of the most salient embodiments of this blur between aesthetics and personal identities. And I know this because I was there, I witnessed it in other people, and I too was a Lana stan during this era. Everything about her Born to Die and Ultraviolence albums had all of Tumblr in a chokehold. And because those projects were centered around profound sadness, self-destruction, and emotional chaos through cinematic visuals and a strong sense of style, it turned emotional suffering that a young person who might not have the tools to navigate maturely into something aesthetically immersive. Like this woman was singing "He Hit Me and It Felt Like a Kiss" to a film camera with almond red acrylics and lace detailing, and teenagers with a half-developed frontal lobe were eating it up. Another thing about Tumblr that I feel like a lot of people don't talk about much is how it helped make progressive discourse socially visible online, specifically discourse around queerness, mental health, and a person's identity in relation to the social status quo. There were people on Tumblr as young as 16 talking about their lived experiences from a race, class, gender, and ability-based framework. And the reason why this happened was because as these conversations were happening on there, it kind of flattened academic discourse into internet native language, which made analyzing and recognizing your social positioning a thing that you could participate in culturally. It moved forms of critical analysis from college classrooms and less publicly accessible spaces into the social and cultural zeitgeist. I actually was just starting college during this time, and thanks to these conversations, I remember I was able to walk into my social science classes with a pretty strong foundation of the themes and topics that were going to be explored. There was also an element of openness that contributed to the socially conscious discourse because since some people used Tumblr anonymously / pseudonymously, they were able to share their lived experiences without having to out themselves if they were queer or just reveal the person behind the emotions. And naturally, like any discourse that's heavy and can cause contention, this also simultaneously created conditions for escalation and radicalization through purity politics and moral absolutism. Although these discussions existed obviously long before Tumblr, they pretty much existed in a silo. They were either had in higher educational settings, within activist collectives, and maybe occasionally between news correspondents on TV, but this wasn't exactly the youth's media of choice, that might be different now because news has been integrated into the social media experience. I actually have a video on that if you want to check it out, but that obviously wasn't a thing yet during this time. Last but not least on my list of Tumblr's cultural impact is fandom culture and how it transformed collective appreciation for a piece of media into some of today's internet behaviors. If you were a part of a fandom, and this still exists today, which is my point here, you were essentially a machine that contributed to a perpetually active ecosystem that was fueled by a constant churn of content. Whether it was about One Direction, Supernatural, or Harry Potter, fandom members were talking about their faves and contributing to the worlds that they existed in by both creating and distributing more media on the platform using what or whoever they were a fan of as source media. People made gift sets, edits, which are now known as fan cams. They wrote fan fiction. Fan fiction was even referenced in season 1 of Euphoria. I was actually watching it recently when they were giving Kat's backstory, which is also pretty full circle because the actress who played her was kind of Tumblr famous back in those days. People also clipped moments from movies and shows to frame something that they were writing or just make reaction images, which now pretty much carries a large portion of comment sections across social media platforms. Through Tumblr's fandom culture, interacting with media was about remixing it as much as it was about appreciating it. And the repurposing that happened on there is now a part of internet content and communication behaviors. By the time the mid-2010s came around, Tumblr was a social media platform and a cultural force, and it was valued accordingly when it was bought by Yahoo in 2013 for $1.1 billion. Now, when the sale happened, there were a lot of concerns about what it meant for the future of the platform, but Yahoo's chief executive at the time said she would, quote, not screw it up, and that Tumblr would be operating with David Karp remaining as the CEO. I was a teenager at this time, so I wasn't keeping up with the business of social media. But thinking back to those days, from a user perspective, Tumblr was pretty much still operating business as usual at the time of the sale. And at that point, it hadn't even really reached its peak yet. However, once 2017 came around and Verizon bought Yahoo, this is when things started to go downhill, because by the end of that year, David Karp stepped down as CEO and handed over his role to Jeff D'Onofrio, who implemented the NSFW ban a year later, which many consider the beginning of the end of Tumblr. And the thing is, the issue wasn't the ban of that type of content. It was the enforcement of it and how that played out, because Tumblr relied on automated moderation systems that ended up incorrectly flagging huge amounts of non-explicit content. So people would go on Tumblr only to see that their blogs were censored or their content was removed, or that their accounts were completely banned despite them not being in violation of the policy. After this, users pretty much left in droves, and Tumblr visits reportedly dropped from 521 million in December of 2018 to 437 by 2019, by January of 2019. And by that February, Tumblr's page views dropped 30%. Then, it doesn't end here. In 2019, Verizon sold Tumblr to WordPress for $3 million, which is a massive decline from its $1.1 billion valuation when it was bought by Yahoo just 6 years prior. In my opinion, I don't think Tumblr's downfall is only attributed to corporate ownership and the changes that came as a result of that, because while all of this was happening, the social media landscape was fundamentally changing too. By 2016, platforms were becoming centered around recommendation algorithms, and the mass visibility, monetization, and shift towards personal branding that came as a result of that. Instagram culture, specifically Instagram as a place for people to perform, was exploding. TikTok was beginning its rise, and the creator economy that came about as a result of this was rapidly transforming all of social media into an environment where users weren't curating blogs or pages just around, their interests anymore. They were curating themselves for public consumption in an editorialized manner. And Tumblr was not built for that, nor was it the place people went to engage with social media in that way. Despite everything that's transpired though, Tumblr's not dead. It's still pulling between 135 to 142 million monthly active users. And while that's obviously much smaller compared to other platforms that pull 450 million plus, the people who do use Tumblr today are very engaged. The platform has also reversed its NSFW ban, and it's adopted a recommendation-based algorithm as well. And while Tumblr certainly isn't the cultural powerhouse it once was, we cannot forget its impact. I think it's been made pretty clear throughout this video. So yeah, that is the download on Tumblr. If you made it this far, thank you so much for watching. My name is Crystal, and for more videos like these, analyses on social media, news, culture, and an occasional 101, hit that subscribe button because there's more to come. Till next time.